Hi, everybody. Welcome to our new norm for class. According to the email that we got today from Dr. Mellenchamp, we are supposed to make sure that we put all of our classes online for the rest of the semester. In order to do that, I'm making some videos for you, video narrated PowerPoints, so that we can get through this. And we'll get through it. It's not going to be that difficult. Hopefully you'll be able to see everything that I do and everything that I say. And if you have issues, I'm going to run this through YouTube so that you can hopefully get a closed captioned transcription of what is being said. So we're going to talk about assessment today. So our first thing that I want you to do is to take the assessment pretest. I've uploaded that on the page in Canvas where I put the PowerPoints so that you can go in and download it. And I want you to take that pretest. And I want to see what you know already about assessment. The use of a pretest for assessment is generally happens when we want to find out what it is that students already know about a subject. We're very fond of just putting on our blinders and going straight out and teaching the topic that is at hand. And we don't stop and think about the importance of making sure what our students already know. And so a pretest is designed to identify what they already know. And if this was a real class setting, I would have given you this pretest several days ahead of time before I started to teach this topic. And I would have allowed you to then fill it out, and then I would know what you know already. So I'm gonna I'm gonna kind of break my own rule and assume you don't know a whole lot, but I want you to take the pretest and then keep it out so that you can see it and refer to it as we go through the PowerPoint. So we'll continue to go through the PowerPoint now. I'm assuming you've already done the pretest. So there are actually two types of assessment: formative assessment and summative assessment. And if you got that answer on the pretest correct, I want you to pat yourself on your back, because that's what I want you to take away from this course, is the knowledge of what these are. So formative assessment is the assessment that we do every single day on students, with students. We observe students, we look at the work that they've done as class work, we help them in small group settings. There are many, many different types of formative assessment, but that formative assessment tells me where I can go tomorrow. Do I need to go back and reteach? Or can I assume that students know what has been taught today and move on tomorrow? So formative assessment is that daily ongoing assessment. Summative assessment is end of whatever assessment, end of unit, end of course. I don't intend to go back and reteach. Even if not everybody has it, I don't intend to go back and reteach. I'm moving forward and I will supplement as needed, but I don't intend to go back because summative assessment determines if a student has mastered the course's outcomes. So just keep in mind that if you got those answers correct, you did well. Congratulations, yay. If you didn't, you need to remember these. You'll see these on a case at some point. Okay, so why do we assess? I think we need to think about the issue of achievement in the classroom. On page 405 in your text, there's a chart that talks about the achievement gap. And really, rather than calling it an achievement gap, possibly what we want to think of it as is as a exposure gap, because that's really what it is. When we think about our minority students, our ELL students, our students with special needs, sometimes exposure to certain things has a gap in it. And so what we want to do is to overcome that gap so that everybody can be on an equal footing and move forward. So we need to, when we're thinking about assessment, we need to assess because we need to know what needs to be retaught or what to teach next. So if we give students a formative assessment of some sort, we ought to be able to tell from that whether they've gotten what they should have gotten to that point and whether we can move forward or not. Another reason that we assess is because parents always want to know how their children are progressing. Sometimes you can tell them that time and time and time again, and it doesn't help. I've had parents who have contacted me regularly every 2 weeks in a semester or every week in a semester, and their child still has not done well in the semester because nothing happened from my telling them that their child wasn't doing well toward mastering the course objectives and the standards. And then the third reason that we assess is for the data that we need to plan for instruction, further instruction, or as I said, reteaching earlier. We want to make sure that kids have what they need based on what they're supposed to have mastered in those standards by the end of that current year. We also want to address misconceptions because misconceptions about any kind of topic can sneak in at any time during the time that we're teaching. Students may bring that with them to class from a previous class or a previous experience with the topic information, or the misconception may have occurred from something that we said that students didn't hear the way we thought we had tried to communicate it, or that they only heard part of because they weren't listening very well. So it's important to make sure that those misconceptions are overcome. There was a study done by Harvard University, and it was an interesting study. It's an old study, but it was an interesting study. What they wanted to do was to see about what students knew about the universe. And so as they were leaving graduation, undergrads were leaving graduation, they and their professors, the researchers from Harvard stopped them and asked them some questions about the universe, about how the universe functions, about how planets rotate and what goes around, how they rotate around the sun and that sort of thing. And there was a girl there who had graduated from a Boston high school. She had had an astronomy class in 9th grade, I think it was. And so when she went to Harvard, she didn't have a astronomy class. And that wasn't the only type of question that was on the survey that they were given. But it was interesting to find that she thought that the Earth rotated the sun in a figure eight sort of thing, shape like this, the sun being in the middle. And the researchers were kind of puzzled by that because that's not what happens. And so they decided to try to trace that back. And they ended up talking with her astronomy teacher from 9th grade. And the astronomy teacher said, these were advanced kids. She said, I assume they knew all of that information. And so I didn't really address that very much. I addressed other things. And then the researchers went further and looked at the textbook and found that the confusion was in a graph or a picture, not a graph, a graphic, a picture that was in the textbook that the girl misinterpreted the purpose of that picture being there, and took away from it that the Earth rotated the sun in a figure eight shape. Say all of that to say that it's important for us to know individually what a student knows about a topic or a concept. And it's not enough to ask just, does everybody understand? Because as you know, if I do that in class, you may not understand, but you may not want to speak out. Or you think you understand, but you really don't understand. And so the misconception continues. And so it's not enough just to say to the class, okay, what questions do you have? Because if they don't know they have questions, they're not going to answer. So it's important in some way to assess what they know so that you will, a more concrete way to assess what they know so that you'll know, so that you can clear up any misconceptions that need to be cleared up. One of the things that we do with assessment a lot of times in schools is that we accumulate the various types of assessments that we do, the scores from the various types of assessments that we do, to give us a full picture of just what the child knows. So what kind of data do you need to collect on a child? Now think about this broadly. I'm the teacher of whatever grade level. Let's say I'm in, I don't know, fifth grade, sixth grade, something like that. These are the kinds of things that I'm going to want to know, and I'm going to have a place to put them. What I did when I was in my classroom in public school, I had some 3-inch notebooks, and I'd start the semester with a 3-inch notebook, and or the year with a 3-inch notebook, and then across the year I would start another one as I needed one. So it usually ended up that I ended up with 3 data notebooks per class per year. So my first period class, let's say, I would have 3-inch notebooks by the end of the year full of data about students, and having used that data in order to determine what and how I was going to approach my instruction. So these are some of the things that I put in there. I put in demographic information. So I took a family reading survey that asked students and parents to respond to the kinds of reading that they did in the home, and the kinds of the thought process that parents have about their own students, and their reading abilities. I had other demographic data in there where information, a child's address, the set of phone numbers that I could get for the child in case I needed to call home. Any kind of ethnic data, race and ethnicity data, all of that was in my notebook. I had reading level data. I knew from basic reading inventories what level my children scored out on. So I had inventories that came from I taught Read 180. So I had inventories that came from Read 180, or not inventories, but reading data, assessment data that came from Read 180 that told me where what level my students were reading on. We also had what we call FCAT, which is like our Georgia milestones here, data that would tell me what level, Lexile level, my children were reading on. And so I had that information. I had running records that I had done during class. You may or may not know, but a running record is just simply that observational data that I'm taking on a child as I work through my day's instruction. I would always have a clipboard with me that had mailing labels on it, those little mailing labels that are about this big, adhesive mailing labels. And I'd have a sheet of those on the clipboard. And as I went around, any notes I needed to take, I would date the label, put the child's name on it, and then note down whatever I needed to note. And then at the end of the day, I would take that label off and put it on a sheet of paper in my data notebook so that they could then see, so that I could see what my observational data was, what my running records were. And I noted down all kinds of things, anything I thought I needed to remember about the progress that child was making in class went on those labels. And then I had a page dedicated for each child. And so on that page, I would put those labels. And that saved me from having to think about it at the end of the day after I had, taught 150 kids, to try to remember exactly what one child in my first period class needed to have noted on their page. So it was a quick way to do that. Another thing that I had in there were daily classwork grades, the formative assessments that I was doing that helped me to know how students were progressing in their daily classwork. I had homework grades. For me, my only homework was reading, so it was a reading log, but there was a grade attached to that reading log, and the reading logs themselves actually went into that notebook as well. I had benchmark grades from when we did benchmark testing, those tests that you do prior to the standardized test that tell you how your student population is moving toward mastering those standardized tests that we give every year, the milestones, for instance. Test grades, I had test grades that were recorded in there. Those were summative assessments. I had grouping configurations, various grouping configurations that I had my kids grouped into. So whatever group they were a part of, I had made a note in there so that I would know, I would have a record of what group they had worked with and what that group was doing at the time. And remember, groups should be fluid. Once you put a child in a group for a specific reason, and then once that child has mastered that, then you move them to another group. So I had that in there. I had my parent call log was right there handy because all that other information was in there. I wanted my parent call log there too. I always wrote down every time I contacted a parent, I had a chart and I wrote down the date and what we talked about and what the results of that conversation were. And then any disciplinary actions that I had to take with the child. So if I had to write a referral or if I had to give the child detention, all of that went in there as well. It was sort of my total record about these children. And so that's why there were 3 of them by the end of the semester, because that's a lot of data to keep. But you want to keep the data because those assessments in various ways are what you use to inform your instruction. On page 428 in your text, there is a chart that talks about Alicia. And I want you to take a minute, stop the video, take a minute, or stop the PowerPoint, take a minute, and think about what is revealed to us in that chart, and then we'll continue. Okay, now that you're back, you've looked at Alicia's profiling form, and the things that the biggest thing that I wanted you to note was the fact that in the fall, Alicia was proficient in phonics and word recognition, but she only scored developing in fluency and developing in vocabulary acquisition and use. And some of this is because if you think about fluency, it's very hard to think a lot about fluency with emerging readers. Because they're still learning the mechanics of reading. And so it's hard to be fluent when you're still learning to be a reader. But once you've learned those mechanics of reading, the whole idea of here's the words, I have to read the words, here are the words in sentences, I have to understand the words in sentences, then you can focus on fluency. And so she is probably a low reader, I would think. Because she's fluent in phonics and word recognition, but is only developing in fluency and vocabulary acquisition. So those are some areas that then would need some work. So what kind of work would I do? So you can look at, there's a chart on page 429 of your text that gives you lots of ideas, but there are plenty of things that you could do with Alicia. You could target some fluency exercises with her. Can she do some 1-minute fluency testing with her periodically to see if she's making progress? Making sure that I'm doing some pre-reading pre-reading and during reading and even post-reading instruction on vocabulary that is pertinent to whatever topic it is that we're working with at the time. And making sure that I boost her skills in those areas. As I said earlier, all of our instructional decisions should be data-based. Now, there would be people who would argue with us and say, no, it's not data-based instructional decision. It's what the district tells us to do instructional decision, and that is true to some extent. But what I would like it to be in an ideal situation is data-based instructional decisions. So I look at that formative data that I collect on each student each day, and then proceed on that the next day. I would compile that into class data. So in my data notebook, I not only had information related to each student individually, but I also had information on the class as a whole. And let's say I was charting their progress on fluency, just as they did on Alicia, that profile on Alicia. I would have a page that would show where my students were as far as fluency went. And it would have the students' names down the side, and then across I would have the measures that I used to determine where they were with their fluency. And I would record their scores on whatever it was. And then I could look at that page and I could say, okay, here I have 10 kids in my 30 kids in the class. 10 of them are doing fine. They're proficient in this area of whatever it was, fluency that I was working on. I then would look and I would see maybe I have 5 of the remaining students that were, or let's say 10 of the remaining students that were almost there, but not quite. And so I'm sure that a little bit of work with them, a little bit of personal intervention on my part with them will get them where they need to be. And then the other 10 might be my very lowest readers. And I would have to have a very structured, very developed plan for figuring out what to do to help them. And so this chart would show me that. It would show me the gaps in my class so that then I could form groups out of those gaps and know what to do. For instance, there was a strategy that was talked about in the textbook called if-then thinking. And the whole process behind that is if a student shows need in this particular area, fill in the blank, whatever it is, then I should teach this reading skill, and I would name that specifically using this strategy, and I would name that strategy specifically. And I would know exactly the problem the child was having, the skill that needed to be addressed, and the strategy that I was going to use to address that skill. So that if-then thinking is a good way to think about your class as a whole. Not just putting kids in groups because we put kids in groups, but putting kids in groups deliberately with forethought about what exactly it is that they need. So when you're thinking about data that you would need to collect for a class on page 429 through 432 in your textbook, enrollment information about that child might be important, particularly if it's an ELL child. If you need to know what the home language is, what's being spoken in the home. If the child has any English at all, you need to know that. If they don't have any English, you need to know that as well. So those kinds of data are helpful. Charts that show that those class ranges of reading levels and grades on benchmarks and grades on tests and the data for the way that you're grouping. So you've got all of those things individually on each child, but you also have class data. And I think this, if you can do this kind of data work, then your principal is going to be extremely proud of you, extremely excited that you've got this kind of handle on looking at your class and looking at the data in your class. One of the things that we have to think about also is high stakes testing. When we think about assessment, and that summative assessment, high stakes tests are called high stakes or have become high stakes recently. We've always had achievement tests that took place in any grade. At the end of the year, you had a test that determined, it was sort of a cumulative test that sort of determined the what you learned during that semester. And they weren't really high stakes. It was it was just meant to see what you had learned. It wasn't something that we got all sick at our stomach about and that we worried about for days and that we crammed for days. But now in this testing climate that we have in our schools today, these high test stakes become high stakes tests and cause all of those negative feelings because the scores that a student makes on them have some bearing on whether they're promoted or not, or what class they're placed in for the next year, or what course they're placed in for the next year. High stakes testing, standardized testing, was never intended to be used for this purpose. It was simply to be intended to be used for determining whether a child had gotten what they were supposed to get from a particular year's worth of instruction. They were not meant to be competitive at all. They were norm referenced, but they were not meant to be competitive at all. It was just where you were. It was just where you stood at the end of the year. But now the problem is that we use them for so many different things that they become high stakes. And we have issues with that. So think about that question at the bottom of the page there. Should teachers spend months on test prep for all students? We're not going to discuss that as a group, obviously. We would if we were in class together, but we're not going to do that right now together. But think about that. Do you think that teachers should spend months and months and months on test prep for students so that they will do well on the milestones? And teachers feel the need to do this because the results on the milestones sort of are taken into account with their own evaluations. So if the students of a teacher don't do well on the milestones, then that tells against the teacher and the teacher's ability to be a good teacher. So there's issues with that. One of the things that I'd like to suggest is that if you think about test prep, and I'm not against test prep, I think the students particularly need to know how to take bubble test for a multiple choice test. They need to know how to take that, and they need to know how to respond to a test in that way. So they have to have some practice and some preparation for that. But I would encourage you to think about test prep instead of, I'll put all of that to February and spend the whole month of February doing test prep because in March they take the milestones or whenever. I read something not too long ago that a teacher recommended that what you do instead is to spend 15 minutes a week every Friday in some sort of test prep. And if you do that, then your students will be well prepared. It's sort of a coupling of your instruction. If your instruction is appropriate and you're instructing the way you should be instructing on the things that you should be instructing, plus that little 15 minutes a week that you spend on some test prep throughout the year will give you the results that you want on those tests from those students. So think about it in those terms. We need to talk a little bit about test reliability and test validity. The standardized tests are considered reliable and valid. And really what this means is these definitions are listed here. A test is considered reliable when that test provides the same results for the same children with repeated testing, no matter who gave the test. So if we're looking at the milestones, for instance, we get the same kind of results in general from all third graders across the nation, or all sixth graders across the nation, or all 12th graders across the nation. No matter who gives that test, every child who takes that test, the general results are the same. A test is considered, and that's good. The reliability issue is a good thing. You want that test to be reliable across large populations of children, even if that large population is only the 30 kids in your class. A test is considered valid when the test measures what it claims to measure. So if the test is measuring reading ability, does it really measure reading ability? Do the constructions of the questions really measure readability? is what you're looking at. There can be a threat to validity that we need to be aware of. What can happen is we can get inaccurate reading levels, and that's caused sometimes by the way the test is used or the test is written. So we have to be careful about that. The Lexile chart on page 410 in your text is the Lexiles of where your students ought to be at any point in time in particular grade levels. And if we're using something like the milestones to determine the Lexile level, reading level of a student, if a test like that is not written well, then that can indicate that can cause skewing on either side. It could be skewed toward the low end, meaning that it's the test itself produces lower readers or scores that would indicate lower readers, not readers. Or it could be skewed the other way. It could be skewed that the test indicates that readers are better than they actually are. So we have to think about those things. One of the things we also have to think about is that ELL students, when they take standardized tests, there's an issue because those standardized tests have been normed. And what that means is that they've been given in a pilot format over and over and over again before they become official in any particular setting to students who speak English, not to students who speak other languages. And so ELL students can suffer. If the language used in the test has a bias for English-speaking students, meaning that English-speaking students would know this word or these words, but ELL students might not know these words, then there's going to be an issue with that. So we have to think about that. We have to balance things. It's a delicate balance when it comes to testing equality or equity for ELL students and other students who already speak English. So we have to think about it in those terms. Really what we want to do is make sure for any student, we're not looking at just one assessment to determine where they are and what they know. So we can look at things like outcome assessments. These are like, for instance, benchmark tests that tell us from point to point to point where an entire class is on any particular step of the instruction. Another type of assessment is a screening assessment. That gives us initial information about what students know. Think pre-tests. What do students know prior to the instruction already about that topic? Do I need to provide connections for those students because otherwise they're not going to get it? Or do they have some knowledge and then I can just build on that knowledge as I instruct? Diagnostic assessment is assessment that takes place to determine what difficulties a child might have in reading and what we can do to address those difficulties. In EDUC 3338 or 6638, you're going to learn how to use the basic reading inventory. And that's a great inventory that will give you lots and lots of information about the needs of the child that you're working with. And then another final type of assessment are progress monitoring assessments. Progress monitoring assessments are assessments that we use to figure out how a child is doing on a daily basis, and they're used to plan for further instruction. So they are those sort of formative kinds of assessments that we do with students as we're going through instruction to make sure they're getting what we want them to know. Informal assessment, as we've talked a little bit about already, is any assessment that gives us an idea of how each child is doing with that instruction. So we can do observations, those running records we talked about. You'll also hear that called kid watching, because really that's what we're doing. We're watching kids to see if they really are getting what they need to get. Conferencing with children, talking to children about what they're learning can be important. Classwork, obviously, what the progress that they're making on assignments that you give in class, homework assignments if you give homework, quizzes that you give in class or tests that you give in class, discussion settings where we're learning what kids know. But remember, with a discussion, you don't always know what every child in that room knows because not every child in that room responds in a discussion. So it may take multiple discussions to get a response from everybody. And then something as simple as think, pair, share, where you have had kids think individually, pair together, talk about whatever topic is at hand, and then share their understanding with the rest of the class. So by that sort of oral report, if you want to look at it that way, you are able to tell what they know about a particular topic. On the chart on page 413, there are plenty of specific assessments. Some of these are really interesting to use in the classroom. Something like expository test frames. So in an expository test frame, a student tells what he or she understood of what was read. So think of this in terms of almost like a comic book. You could have kids draw what they understand and illustrate what they understand, or you could have them write what they understand in the frames. If we were checking to make sure a child knew the concept of beginning, middle, and end, we might read them a story and then we might have them either write or draw a picture of the beginning of the story, one related to the middle of the story and one related to the end of the story. Informal reading inventories are those basic reading inventories that basic reading inventory that we've talked about. There's a lot of those out and about. Every school district uses whatever they've chosen to use. But basically what they do is help a teacher to figure out where a student is lacking and then plan for instruction to address that. Curriculum-based measurements, CBMs, test for three things. They test reading fluency, they test spelling, and they test written expression. And there's an example of this on page 424 in your text. Generally, for curriculum-based measurements, we measure 3 times a year. We measure at the beginning of school to get a baseline data. We measure at Christmas-ish, right after they get back from Christmas, to see what they've learned in those 3 months of instruction. And then at the end of the year, for an additional 3 or 4 months of instruction, what have they learned? So that students should be showing growth in all 3 areas. They should be showing growth in their reading fluency, in their spelling, and in their written expression. Another type of assessment that we use sometimes is performance assessment. And in performance assessment, we allow students to show us in various ways what they've learned. But it isn't generally a testing sort of situation that we use. We use some other choices for students. We might use a monologue choice where students can become a character in a story to tell about that story or tell about their place in that story. Out of this comes things like the wax museums that you'll see put on by elementary and middle and sometimes high school, where students become a famous inventor or a famous discoverer of something or explorer. And they have to dress like that character, and they have to explain to those people who walk around in front of them, just as you would at a wax museum. There's a button you push and then the student starts to talk. They're a lot of fun to do, as you can tell, imagine rather. But letting a child really talk through what they've learned. Skits can be valuable. If a student can produce a script and act out that script in a skit, that tells you that they are comprehending what they're reading. For whatever it's about, it could be a nonfiction topic or a fiction topic, and it could be at any grade level, grades K through 12. Another thing might be creating a diorama in some way, or portfolio assignments where a child has gathered together, excuse me, where a child has gathered together assignments across, say, a semester or a 9 weeks grading period, and then have put them together. Their best products have put together in a portfolio, similar to what an artist would do, maybe, that shows the variety of their work and their skills that they have. And then they present that at the end of the 9 weeks, or at the end of the semester, or at the end of the year, even. Projects you can use. There's all kinds of performance assessments. And the value to this is that, number one, it's choice. So if students choose to do it in a certain way, they're going to put more effort into it. It's their choice. The second thing is that it gets around the whole idea of students who maybe don't test very well. They may be perfectly fine sitting down and talking it out with you or with a group, as in the monologue, but they don't test well in a pencil and paper sort of setting. So any of performance assessments are valuable. They can be used as summative assessment. They can be used as formative assessment, and you really get better results from those sometimes than you do from a traditional test. That isn't to say that you shouldn't use traditional tests. That just means that we should build into our instruction across a year opportunities for students to use a choice board of things to show their learning in the best way that they can show their learning. And that's it.